Steven Seagal's debut wasn't just another action flick, it was born from a Hollywood agent's outrageous bet, featured real baby photos in opening credits, accidentally broke the star's nose, and launched careers while secretly filming at tech conventions with fake press credentials. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Above the Law. Fact 1. The $1 million bet origin story. Steven Seagal's path to Hollywood stardom began with what might be the most unusual casting story in movie history. Michael Ovitz, one of the most powerful talent agents in Hollywood and co-founder of Creative Artists Agency, reportedly made an outrageous bet that he could turn absolutely anyone into a movie star. To prove his point, he decided to test his theory on the most unlikely candidate he could think of: his own Aikido instructor. Ovitz had been taking martial arts lessons at Seagal's West Hollywood dojo, where the ponytailed instructor taught traditional Japanese Aikido to wealthy clients and celebrities. Unlike other martial arts that focused on kicks and punches, Aikido emphasized using an opponent's energy against them through throws and joint locks. Seagal had spent years in Japan mastering this ancient art and had become the first non-Japanese person to operate an Aikido school there. When Ovitz decided to put his money where his mouth was, he chose Seagal as his guinea pig for this Hollywood experiment. The super agent believed so strongly in his ability to manufacture stardom that he was willing to finance Seagal's screen test out of his own pocket. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore, it was about demonstrating the sheer power of Hollywood's star-making machinery. The screen test went so well that Warner Brothers immediately offered Seagal a 3-picture deal. Ovitz had asked his Aikido teacher to star in Above the Law as a personal favor, and just like that, a martial arts instructor with zero acting experience became the lead in a major studio film. The gamble paid off spectacularly when Above the Law became a box office success, launching Seagal's career and proving that Ovitz's boast wasn't just empty Hollywood talk. In an industry where most actors struggle for years to get noticed, Seagal had essentially walked through the back door straight into stardom. Fact 2. Real baby photos in opening credits. Above the Law opens with something that sounds like it should be a documentary rather than an action movie. As Steven Seagal's deep voice narrates the backstory of his character Nico Toscani, viewers see a series of childhood photographs showing a young boy growing up in an Italian-American family. What makes this opening sequence genuinely bizarre is that every single one of these pictures is real, pulled directly from Steven Seagal's actual family photo albums. The opening credits feature authentic images from Seagal's youth, including baby photos, childhood snapshots, and family portraits that span from his earliest years through his teenage period. This wasn't a case of the production team hiring child actors or staging fake family photos to create a fictional backstory. Instead, Seagal literally handed over his personal photo collection to be used as part of the movie's opening sequence, blurring the line between his real life and his fictional character in a way that most actors would never consider. This unusual choice reflects Seagal's approach to his entire film debut, where he claimed that portions of the story were autobiographical. The narrator describes Nico as the child of Sicilian immigrants who discovered martial arts at a baseball game and dedicated his life to mastering the ancient art, which mirrors elements of Seagal's own background. By using his actual childhood photos, Seagal was essentially presenting his character's origin story as if it were a real documentary about his own life. The effect is strangely intimate and unsettling for viewers who expect clear boundaries between actors and their roles. Watching a chubby baby who would grow up to become an action star creates an oddly personal connection that most Hollywood films never establish. This decision to use real family photos became one of the first signs that Seagal would consistently blur the lines between his public persona and his movie characters throughout his career. Fact 3. Broken nose on set. The climactic fight scene between Steven Seagal and villain Henry Silva turned out to be more realistic than anyone intended when Silva accidentally broke Seagal's nose during filming. This wasn't a minor bump or scratch that could be covered up with makeup, but a genuine injury that required immediate medical attention and sent the star of the movie straight to the emergency room. Henry Silva, a veteran actor known for playing menacing villains in countless films and television shows, was filming the final confrontation between his character Seagal and Seagal's Nico Toscani. During one of the fight choreography sequences, Silva's movements connected with Seagal's face in a way that nobody had planned, resulting in a broken nose that was both painful and potentially problematic for the production schedule. The injury could have easily shut down filming for days or even weeks, especially since this was the climactic scene that the entire movie had been building toward. A broken nose doesn't just hurt, it also causes immediate swelling and bruising that would have been impossible to hide on camera. For most actors, this kind of injury would have meant significant delays while they recovered enough to continue filming without looking like they had just been in a real fight. However, Seagal's response to the accident demonstrated the kind of dedication that would become part of his tough guy legend. After being rushed to the hospital and having his nose properly treated, he made the decision to return to work the very next day. To prevent the telltale black eyes that typically accompany a broken nose, Seagal spent the entire night applying ice to his face, rotating between different cold packs to keep the swelling and discoloration under control. His commitment to finishing the scene allowed the production to stay on schedule and complete the movie without major disruptions. Fact 4. Chair. Breaking audition. Daniel Feraldo's audition for the role of Tony Salvano in Above the Law turned into one of the most unconventional casting sessions in Hollywood history when he literally tried to break furniture over Steven Seagal's back. This wasn't part of some elaborate stunt audition or a test of physical acting skills, but rather a desperate attempt to prove he could be intimidating enough to play a convincing villain opposite the martial arts expert. When Feraldo first walked into the audition room, director Andrew Davis immediately had concerns about the casting choice. Looking at the actor's relatively small stature compared to Seagal's imposing presence, Davis worried that Feraldo simply wouldn't be physically believable as someone who could pose a genuine threat to the Aikido master. In action movies, especially those featuring martial arts, the physical dynamics between hero and villain are crucial for creating believable conflict and tension. Rather than simply dismissing Feraldo from consideration, Seagal himself came up with an unusual solution to test whether the actor could overcome his size disadvantage. Seagal suggested that Feraldo should try to actually scare him, essentially challenging the auditioning actor to prove that he could be genuinely intimidating despite being smaller than his potential co-star. This was an extraordinary request that went far beyond the typical line readings and scene work that most auditions involve. Feraldo's response was equally extraordinary. Instead of trying to act scary through facial expressions or vocal intimidation, he decided to take a more direct approach by attempting to break a chair over Seagal's back. This wasn't a choreographed move or a stage demonstration, but a real attempt to use physical force to prove his point. The bold and somewhat reckless move apparently convinced both Seagal and Davis that Feraldo had the kind of unpredictable energy and willingness to commit that would make him perfect for the role of Salvano. Fact 5. Secret convention filming. The production team of Above the Law pulled off one of Hollywood's most elaborate deceptions when they secretly filmed scenes at a major technology convention by pretending to be legitimate news reporters. The movie's script called for scenes to take place at the Chicago Summer Consumer Electronics Show, but when scheduling conflicts made it impossible to film at the actual event, the filmmakers came up with a creative and somewhat dishonest solution. Instead of building expensive sets or finding alternative locations, the crew decided to film at the November Computer Dealer Exposition, known as Comdex, which was taking place in Las Vegas. This wasn't just a simple matter of changing locations, it required an elaborate scheme to gain access to a restricted trade show where filming wasn't permitted. The convention organizers and exhibitors had no idea that a major Hollywood production was about to use their event as an unauthorized movie set. To pull off this deception, the entire film crew obtained fake press credentials that identified them as journalists covering the Technology Expo for a news program. They carried cameras and equipment that looked like standard television news gear, allowing them to blend in with the legitimate media representatives who were actually reporting on the latest computer products and industry developments. The crew members had to act the part convincingly, pretending to interview exhibitors and film product demonstrations while actually capturing footage for their action movie. The scheme worked so well that nobody at Comdex realized they were being used as extras in a Steven Seagal film. The convention attendees, exhibitors, and organizers all assumed they were simply witnessing normal news coverage of the event. This guerrilla filmmaking approach allowed the production to capture authentic footage of a real technology convention without paying the substantial fees that would have been required for official filming permits, creating realistic background scenes that would have been expensive and difficult to recreate on a studio soundstage. Fact 6. Personal weapon selection. Steven Seagal took an unusually hands-on approach to the firearms used in Above the Law by personally selecting every single weapon that appears throughout the entire film. This level of involvement in the armory department was virtually unheard of for a first-time actor, but Seagal's extensive knowledge of firearms and his role as both star and producer gave him the authority to make these detailed decisions about the movie's weaponry. Most action movies rely on professional prop masters and armory specialists to choose appropriate firearms based on the script's requirements, the characters' backgrounds, and what looks good on camera. However, Seagal brought his own expertise to the selection process, choosing specific models and types of weapons that he felt would be authentic for each character and situation. His background as a martial arts instructor and his claims about military and law enforcement connections meant he had strong opinions about which firearms would be most realistic for a Chicago police officer and the various criminals and government agents in the story. Seagal's weapon choices reflected his attention to detail and his desire for authenticity in the action sequences. For his character Nico Toscani, he selected a Colt government model pistol, which was a realistic choice for a Chicago police detective in the 1980s. The decision to use this particular firearm wasn't random or based solely on what looked impressive on screen, but rather came from Seagal's understanding of what weapons law enforcement officers would actually carry during that time period. This level of personal involvement in the technical aspects of filmmaking extended beyond just picking weapons that looked cool or dramatic. Seagal's selections were based on his knowledge of how different firearms functioned, their reliability, and their appropriateness for the various characters who would be using them. His attention to these details helped create more realistic action sequences and demonstrated the kind of control he wanted to maintain over every aspect of his film debut. Fact 7. John C. Reilly's disputed debut. One of the most persistent myths in Hollywood involves John C. Reilly's supposed film debut in Above the Law, where the Internet Movie Database claims he appeared as an uncredited thug in bar during a fight scene. This widely repeated piece of trivia has been accepted as fact for decades, but careful examination of the actual movie reveals that this information is completely wrong, creating one of the most enduring cases of mistaken identity in film history. The confusion stems from a bar brawl scene where Steven Seagal's character gets into a fight with several men, and according to various online sources, one of these unnamed thugs was supposedly played by the future Academy Award nominee. However, when viewers actually watch this scene, the person identified as Reilly is clearly Michael Rooker, who received proper screen credit as Man in Bar for his appearance in the film. Rooker, who would later become famous for roles in movies like Guardians of the Galaxy and the Walking Dead television series, has a distinctly different appearance from Reilly and was already an established actor by 1988. The mistake appears to have originated from database errors that were then copied and repeated across multiple websites and reference sources without anyone bothering to verify the information by actually watching the movie. John C. Reilly himself has addressed this persistent myth during interviews, confirming that he was not in Above the Law and that his actual film debut came the following year in Brian De Palma's Casualties of War, where he played a significant supporting role alongside Sean Penn and Michael J. Fox. This case demonstrates how easily incorrect information can become accepted as fact in the internet age, especially when it involves minor details that most people never think to question. The myth has become so widespread that it continues to appear in articles and trivia lists, despite being definitively debunked by the actor himself and anyone who takes the time to actually examine the scene in question. Fact 8. Aikido boom creation. Above the Law single-handedly triggered a global explosion of interest in Aikido that transformed Steven Seagal's martial arts school from a struggling business into an overnight success story. Before the movie's release in April of 1988, Aikido was relatively unknown to most Americans who were more familiar with the flashy kicks and punches of karate or kung fu that dominated martial arts movies and television shows. The timing of this Aikido boom couldn't have been more dramatic for Seagal's personal finances. His Los Angeles dojo had been struggling to attract students and was facing serious financial difficulties before Above the Law hit theaters. The martial arts school that had once provided a steady income for the future movie star was barely keeping its doors open, with classes that often had only a handful of participants and monthly expenses that far exceeded the revenue from student tuition and fees. However, everything changed almost immediately after audiences saw Seagal's unique fighting style on the big screen. Unlike the acrobatic martial arts that moviegoers were accustomed to seeing, Aikido focused on using an opponent's energy against them through throws, joint locks, and redirected momentum. The fluid movements and seemingly effortless way that Seagal's character defeated multiple attackers fascinated viewers who had never seen anything like this particular martial art before. The transformation was so dramatic that Seagal's dojo went from struggling to survive, to selling out every single class within weeks of the movie's release. Students who had watched Above the Law flooded martial arts schools around the world, specifically asking to learn the same techniques they had seen on screen. This worldwide Aikido boom wasn't limited to the United States. Martial arts schools in Europe, Asia, and other continents reported similar increases in enrollment from people who wanted to master the art that had made Steven Seagal look so formidable in his film debut. Fact 9. Originally, a Clint Eastwood project, the script that eventually became Above the Law began its Hollywood journey as one of many projects that Warner Brothers had been stockpiling specifically for Clint Eastwood, but Steven Seagal completely transformed it into something entirely different when he selected it from the studio's collection of potential Eastwood vehicles. This wasn't just a case of one actor replacing another in an existing story. It was a complete reimagining of the entire project to fit Seagal's unique background and personality. Warner Brothers had accumulated a substantial collection of action scripts over the years, holding them in reserve for the right opportunity to work with Eastwood, who was one of their most bankable stars. These scripts typically featured tough, morally complex protagonists who operated in gray areas between law and justice, which perfectly matched Eastwood's established screen persona from his Dirty Harry films and spaghetti westerns. The original version of what would become Above the Law was apparently written with Eastwood's particular style and image in mind. However, when Seagal was given the opportunity to choose from this collection of scripts, he saw potential for something completely different. Rather than simply stepping into a role that had been designed for another actor, Seagal worked with the writers to completely rewrite the story to incorporate elements of his own alleged personal history. The original concept was transformed from a typical Eastwood-style urban vigilante story into something that claimed to draw from Seagal's supposed experiences with the Central Intelligence Agency and his background in martial arts. This rewriting process changed not just the action sequences and character development, but also the entire setting and tone of the movie. The original story about corruption on the San Francisco waterfront was moved to Chicago and refocused around Seagal's character as an Italian-American Aikido expert with claimed connections to both the CIA and organized crime. Many of these biographical elements that Seagal insisted on including have never been verified and remain disputed to this day. Fact 10. Fake arm and final scene. The climactic fight between Steven Seagal and Henry Silva contains one of the most obvious special effects blunders in 1980s action cinema, where a fake prosthetic arm becomes embarrassingly visible during the moment when Nico breaks the villain's limb. This scene was supposed to be the dramatic high point of the entire movie, where the hero finally gets his revenge against the corrupt CIA agent who had tortured prisoners in Vietnam, but instead it became an unintentional comedy moment for observant viewers. During the final confrontation between Nico Toscani and Kurt Zagon, Seagal's character uses an Aikido technique to grab and twist his opponent's arm in a way that would cause a severe fracture. To create the illusion of this bone-breaking move without actually injuring Henry Silva, the production team used a prosthetic arm that was supposed to look realistic enough to fool audiences during the brief moment it appeared on screen. However, the fake limb was so poorly constructed and obviously artificial that it stands out like a beacon to anyone who knows what to look for. The prosthetic arm has a noticeably different skin tone than Silva's actual complexion, creating a jarring color mismatch that immediately draws attention to the special effect. Even more problematic is the fact that the fake hand remains completely rigid and motionless throughout the entire sequence, never flexing or moving in the natural way that a real hand would during such an intense physical struggle. The hand stays locked in exactly the same position from the moment the prosthetic appears until the scene cuts away, creating an unnatural stillness that makes it obvious that viewers are looking at a piece of rubber or plastic rather than a living limb. This kind of special effects failure was more common in lower-budget films of the era, when digital effects weren't available and practical effects had to be created quickly and cheaply to stay within production schedules and budgets. Fact 11. Accidentally, prophetic CIA plot. Above the Law featured a conspiracy plot that seemed like pure Hollywood fiction in 1988, but turned out to be disturbingly close to reality when investigative journalist Gary Webb exposed actual CIA involvement in crack cocaine trafficking 8 years later. The movie's central storyline involves corrupt CIA agents using drug money to fund illegal operations, with specific focus on how these activities devastated poor urban communities across America. In the film, Steven Seagal's character discovers that his former CIA colleague Kurt Zagon is running a drug smuggling operation that brings cocaine into American cities while using the profits to finance covert government activities. The movie presents this as a conspiracy where government agents deliberately flood disadvantaged neighborhoods with drugs, causing addiction, violence, and social destruction while enriching themselves and funding off-the-books operations that Congress never approved. When the movie was released, audiences and critics generally viewed this plot as typical action movie paranoia, the kind of over-the-top government conspiracy theory that Hollywood loved to use as a backdrop for shootouts and martial arts sequences. The idea that the Central Intelligence Agency would actually participate in drug trafficking seemed like the sort of far-fetched premise that only worked in entertainment, not something that could happen in real life. However, in 1996, Gary Webb published a series of investigative articles in the San Jose Mercury News that revealed genuine connections between CIA-backed Nicaraguan rebels and crack cocaine dealers who were flooding Los Angeles with drugs during the 1980s. Webb's reporting showed that the agency had indeed turned a blind eye to drug trafficking by their allies, and that some of the profits from these operations were used to fund anti-communist activities in Central America. The real-life scandal that Webb uncovered bore striking similarities to the fictional conspiracy that Above the Law had presented as entertainment just 8 years earlier. Fact 12. Chuck Norris almost starred. Instead, Chuck Norris was seriously considered to play the lead role in Above the Law, but contractual obligations with the Cannon Group prevented him from taking on what would have been a completely different kind of action movie than audiences were used to seeing from the martial arts star. This casting possibility would have fundamentally changed the entire direction of the film, since Norris had already established himself as a major action hero through movies like Missing in Action and The Delta Force. At the time that Above the Law was being developed, Norris was one of the biggest names in action cinema, known for his karate skills and his ability to carry low-budget action films that performed well at the box office. His involvement would have brought instant name recognition and a built-in audience to the project, which would have been valuable for a movie that was introducing an unknown actor to mainstream audiences. Director Andrew Davis had previously worked with Norris on Code of Silence in 1985, so there was already an established professional relationship between them. However, Norris was locked into an exclusive contract with the Cannon Group, the production company that had been making his action movies throughout the 1980s. Cannon was known for producing low-budget exploitation films and had built their business model around stars like Norris, who could guarantee international sales regardless of the movie's actual quality. The company was not willing to loan out their biggest star to Warner Brothers for a project that they had no financial stake in. This contractual roadblock forced the filmmakers to look for alternative casting options, which ultimately led them to Steven Seagal through his connection with agent Michael Ovitz. If Norris had been available and chosen for the role, the movie would likely have featured traditional karate and martial arts instead of Aikido, and the entire tone and style of the action sequences would have been completely different from what audiences eventually saw on screen. Fact 13. Student fight choreography. The sword-fighting sequence in Above the Law was performed entirely by Steven Seagal's own martial arts students from his dojo, rather than the professional stunt performers that most Hollywood productions would typically hire for. Such dangerous and technically demanding scenes, this unconventional casting choice reflected Seagal's hands-on approach to his film debut and his desire to showcase authentic martial arts techniques rather than the flashy but unrealistic fight choreography that dominated most action movies of the era. Most film productions rely on experienced stunt coordinators and professional fight performers who specialize in creating combat sequences that look impressive on camera while maintaining safety for all participants. These professionals understand how to use camera angles, editing, and carefully rehearsed movements to create the illusion of violence without anyone getting seriously injured. However, Seagal chose to work with people he had personally trained in traditional Aikido techniques, believing that their authentic martial arts skills would translate to more realistic and compelling fight scenes. Using his own students gave Seagal complete control over the choreography and execution of the sword combat, allowing him to incorporate specific Aikido principles and movements that might have been difficult to teach to unfamiliar stunt performers in the limited time available during production. His students already understood the philosophy and technical requirements of Aikido, which emphasizes using an opponent's energy and momentum against them, rather than relying on brute force or acrobatic displays. This decision also created a unique sense of camaraderie and authenticity during filming, since the people fighting alongside and against Seagal were individuals he had worked with for months or years in his martial arts school. The students understood his fighting style and could anticipate his movements in ways that professional stunt performers might not have been able to achieve without extensive rehearsal time, that the production schedule might not have allowed. Fact 14. Russian bootleg legacy. Russian bootleggers created one of the most bizarre and enduring fake movie franchises in cinema history when they retitled Above the Law as simply Nico, and then proceeded to market every subsequent Steven Seagal film as part of an imaginary series. This unauthorized rebranding turned Seagal's completely unrelated movies into what appeared to be a long-running saga about the same character, in confusing audiences and creating a parallel universe of action cinema that existed only in the bootleg market. The bootleg operation began innocently enough when Russian distributors shortened the original title Above the Law to just Nico, using the name of Seagal's character as the movie's primary identifier. This decision might have been made for simplicity or because the original title didn't translate well into Russian, but it established a naming convention that would spiral into something much more elaborate and misleading over the following years. Rather than returning to normal titles when Seagal's next movies became available, the bootleggers doubled down on their Nico branding by systematically renaming every new Steven Seagal release as a numbered sequel. Hard to Kill became Nico 2, Marked for Death was marketed as Nico 3, Out for Justice transformed into Nico 4. And this pattern continued for years, regardless of the actual content or storylines of the individual films. This created a completely fictional continuity, where Russian audiences believed they were watching the ongoing adventures of the same character across multiple movies, even though Seagal was actually playing different roles with different names, backgrounds, and motivations in each film. The bootleggers maintained this deception for so long that it became an established part of how Seagal movies were known in certain markets, creating a legacy that persisted even after legitimate distribution became more common. The fake franchise numbering system became so entrenched that some viewers were genuinely surprised to learn that these movies were never intended to be connected sequels. Fact 15. Disappearing tire. Continuity error. One of the most glaring continuity mistakes in Above the Law occurs during a high-speed chase sequence where Steven Seagal's car suffers a shot-out tire that seems to have a mind of its own, appearing and disappearing from the wheel rim in a confusing pattern that makes it obvious the scene was filmed using multiple takes with different vehicles. This error is so blatant that it becomes impossible to ignore once viewers know what to look for during the action sequence. The chase begins when Seagal's character comes under fire from pursuing bad guys who manage to shoot out one of his car's tires, creating the kind of dramatic moment that action movies use to increase tension and stakes during vehicle pursuits. The initial shot clearly shows the tire being damaged by gunfire, with rubber fragments flying and the wheel beginning to ride on the metal rim as Seagal struggles to maintain control of his vehicle. However, in the very next shot, the tire has completely vanished from the rim, leaving only the bare metal wheels spinning as the car continues down the street. This creates a jarring visual inconsistency because tires don't simply disappear when they're shot. They deflate, shred, or fall apart, but pieces of rubber typically remain attached to the rim even after severe damage. The completely clean rim suggests that the production used a different car for this particular shot. The continuity error becomes even more confusing in subsequent shots when the tire mysteriously reappears on the rim, only to vanish again moments later as the chase continues. This back-and-forth pattern of appearing and disappearing rubber reveals that the filmmakers were cutting between multiple vehicles during the sequence, some with damaged tires and others with completely bare rims, without paying attention to maintaining visual consistency. The mistake is so obvious that it demonstrates how rushed the editing process must have been, with editors focused more on the overall flow of the action than on ensuring that these crucial details matched from shot to shot.